Now on BBC Two, a special extended edition of Newsnight with Jeremy Vine.
A massive, unexpected attack on America. Thousands may be dead in what's being called the second Pearl Harbor. Tonight, the United States and the world are in shock. Good evening. The world has never before seen terrorism on the scale America experienced today. The World Trade Center had been struck by one hijacked plane when another with passengers on board flew directly into it. This a moment of spectacular destruction and horror. The president, who'd just seen it, looked shaken.
Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
But then came the news that the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. had been hit as well by a third hijacked plane, again to devastating effect. And this was the moment that made the destruction complete. The World Trade Center, where at least 20,000 people work, collapsed. A symbol of American financial dominance destroyed, with as yet untold loss of life. We'll discuss who might have done this, how the US might react, and we'll hear from New York and Washington on what's happening there now. The US has been shaken to its foundations today, and the world may now be a changed place. The sheer scale of the terror and destruction visited on one of the world's most powerful cities was unimaginable, but no less sickening for that. At first it looked like it must have been an appalling accident, a passenger plane crashing into one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center. But then it became clear this was no accident but an attack on the centers of American financial, political and economic power. The fact that there is still not even an estimate of the numbers dead defines the human tragedy. In a moment, David Sells will describe what happened, but first we go live to the scene in New York and our correspondent, Stephen Evans. Stephen, we're receiving reports now of another building collapsing.
That's right, Jeremy. A third building has collapsed. We had the collapse of the two main towers about an hour after the actual explosion, which was about 9:15 in the morning. If you wanted to calculate a time to cause maximum disruption, you would calculate that time. It's the start of the working day and perhaps the biggest, busiest complex in the world. There were those two explosions. I was at the base of one of those buildings and it literally shook. Then people fled out, fled away. One of the problems, it seems to me, is that people didn't quite know how far to go. So then the emergency services starting to arrive, and the collapse of the building happened, of one of the buildings, one of the initial buildings, happened when people were actually quite close to it. But you're absolutely right. We've now had this third building falling to the ground. It is very difficult to imagine anything standing at the end of it all in this complex of 7 buildings. If you think back to the Canary Wharf bombing in the Docklands of London, for example, it was one bomb. One imagines that most of the damage was superficial, if you like, not to the structures themselves, to glass, to furniture. Looking at that scene this morning here in New York, it's hard to imagine anything surviving those two explosions.
Can there be any kind of rescue operation here, given what's happened?
I can't imagine that there will be any kind of rescue operation. It's absolutely impossible to estimate the kinds of numbers under that kind of debris. 50,000 people, as I say, work in those buildings. But one of the problems, it seems to me, and I was just alluding to it, is that the emergency services got there rapidly. There were hundreds of ambulances and fire trucks very, very quickly there. People assumed that the thing was contained. People assumed that there was a series of explosions quite high up in the buildings, and realized quite late, if you like, that actually the thing wasn't contained and the engineering couldn't cope with the force of those blows. So there will be high casualties from the initial attacks, but there may well be casualties from later. I don't know if the lifts were working or not, but I imagine there would have been people who simply couldn't have got down those 110 stories after the attacks. So, as I say, the authorities are now very, very wary indeed. They have structures barely standing amongst the 4 that are now remaining. So I would imagine that they're standing back and trying to make engineering assessments of what can be done. Meanwhile, in the rest of the city, there is an eerie calm here. I'm on Times Square. It's normally one of the busiest parts of this city. You can see it now. There's virtually nobody there. It's normally blasted with adverts. They've, by and large, been turned off. That's partly because the city's been closed so that ambulances can get from the World Trade Center to hospitals, but it's also because people have simply gone home. There wasn't panic when those bombs went up. People were very orderly. There was fear in their voices. Their eyes were getting moist, but people weren't really screaming like you think they might have been screaming. But they've now had, 9.5 hours to think about this thing, and these things do take time to actually sink into your brain. There's a bit of anger about. The American networks are talking about, they're using captions like the attack on America. They're using the words Pearl Harbor quite a lot. They're talking about incidents galvanizing action.
Okay, Stephen Evans in New York, thank you very much indeed. We're joined now as well by Tom Carver in Washington. Tom, what have you been hearing from the American government just in the last hour or so?
Let me tell you what's happening is that George Bush is due to be flying back here, will arrive back here, we assume, within the hour. He's been at an Air Force base in Nebraska, where he's been convening an emergency meeting of the National Security Council by phone. His Vice President, Dick Cheney, is down in what they call the Situation Room underneath the White House with Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor. A number of steps have been taken. The borders of America have been sealed off. The National Guard has been alerted and activated in certain places. And around the world, American forces have been put on the highest form of alert. Later tonight, once George Bush gets back here, he will be making a television address to the nation to obviously try to restore calm and confidence in government. In these moments of history, really, in America, that's when Americans turn to the president.
Right.
Congress seems almost irrelevant and indeed has been evacuated.
Tom, we can see, we're just watching pictures now of the damage to the Pentagon. Are you clear as to the extent of that?
No, I'm not. No, I don't think anyone is. You may be able to see behind me that the smoke is still burning as I speak from the Pentagon. There's a full-scale emergency going on just across the river there, where firemen are trying to dig out the dead and the wounded from the Pentagon. Basically, we understand what happened was that the plane slammed right into the base of one side of the Pentagon and brought all 6 stories of that side of the building down. There were a number of very senior naval officials based in that area. We don't know as to the casualties, but obviously it's going to be quite a few.
Tom Carver in Washington, thanks very much indeed. We're now joined by Orla Guerin in Jerusalem. Orla, there significantly hasn't been universal condemnation of this attack in the Middle East, has there?
Well, the reaction has varied from country to country. We have had condemnation from countries like Syria and also from Iran, although in Iraq, joyous music has been played on state television. I suppose the response that most people have been keen to see is what came from the Palestinians. Now, we had what appeared to be a very genuine statement from a seemingly very shocked Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat. He appeared to be just as stunned by these events as all the rest of us. And he said that he was deeply saddened that it was completely unacceptable, and he offered the sympathy of the Palestinian people. We had various militant Islamic groups, Palestinian groups, rushing forward to say that they were not involved, to deny any kind of connection, although they also did argue that in effect the United States was reaping what it had sown, that it was paying the price for its own policies here in the Middle East, which had caused so much anger. We also did have some limited scenes of celebration, quite shocking scenes in a way, but they were quite small scale. We had some people out on the streets in the West Bank town of Nablus and some here in Jerusalem. But to put that in its context, this was limited. It was not spontaneous mass rejoicing across the West Bank and Gaza. Most Palestinians appear to have been in their homes, glued to their television sets, just like most people everywhere, watching these events unfold with horror. And I think that very many Palestinians will be hoping that there is absolutely no connection to them, to any militant Palestinian groups, and they'll be hoping that in the end that they do not have to pay any kind of price for this.
Oliger, and thank you very much indeed for speaking to us from Jerusalem. Let's now join Martha Carney in Downing Street. What is going on there at the moment, Martha?
Well, the Prime Minister spent the evening talking to other world leaders, to President Chirac, Monsieur Jospin in France, to Gerhard Schröder in Germany, and he's just been talking to Vladimir Putin in Russia. The idea being to try and coordinate some kind of international response to this kind of terrorist outrage to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Earlier this evening, he was also chairing a COBRA meeting, which is the kind of contingency planning meeting of senior ministers to look at all the different measures that need to be taken in this country in terms of responding to what happened in the United States. And after that meeting, he emerged and made this statement from within Downing Street.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
Now, after that very strong statement of support for the United States, he also outlined a number of measures which are going to be taken in this country. He said that security was going to be stepped up at every level. No flights would leave Britain unless maximum security could be guaranteed. Aircraft would no longer be allowed to cross central London, and private flights could only go ahead with special permission, and security is being stepped up at government and military buildings throughout the country, and of course at military bases. Now, that COBRA committee I was talking about, the Contingency Planning Committee, are going to meet at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. It will include the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, and also Alan Milburn, the Health Secretary, which gives you an idea of some of the kind of emergency planning that is now going on.
Martha Carney in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed. We'll be speaking to all the guests here in the studio very shortly, but first David Sells has this report on the terrible events of the day as they unfolded hour after hour.
Doomsday in Manhattan, a terrorist apocalypse. 2 hijacked airliners with 156 people aboard are steered deliberately into New York's tallest building.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
The first plane struck the north tower of this giant building, 110 stories high, one of the city's landmarks. It was just before 9 in the morning. A BBC correspondent, Stephen Evans, was in the Trade Center when it happened.
There was a huge bang. It felt to me like somebody dropped a skip full of rubbish, a great container full of rubbish from a very great height, at which point smoke appeared everywhere, as though a mist had suddenly settled on the building. We all streamed out, some people running, some people crying, nobody really screaming, across the road, and you look up and you can see the top of one of the towers, smoke billowing out from it.
18 minutes later, the second plane was guided into the centre's south tower, already a terrorist exploit without parallel, of uniquely murderous intent and clearly well planned.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower, halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack.
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. And I turned to Hesh. I said, this is it. We're dead. We're not going to make it out of here. I took a fire extinguisher and I bust the window out. That's when this gentleman here heard my cries for help.
And this was only the beginning. Within the hour in Washington, D.C., the capital, a third hijacked airliner is crashed into the Pentagon, the very heart of this superpower's military establishment, a symbolic target par excellence. Thus was America humbled. 24,000 people work in the Pentagon. All survivors had to be evacuated. In New York City, just a few moments later, the BBC's Stephen Evans was telling his tale.
People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads.
It was a tale of the unexpected. The trade centre's south tower, much weakened, collapsed as he spoke, showering rubble into the streets below. 50,000 people work in this vast complex. Nobody yet knows the death toll. The scene was one of chaos. The world was already watching on live television, and reports were now coming in of a fourth airliner crashing in Pennsylvania. A passenger using his mobile phone had called desperately to say, "We're being hijacked, we're being hijacked." And back in New York, survivors in the Trade Center's second tower, seeing what had just happened to the first, began seriously to panic. Some waved, some jumped to almost certain death.
And there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't let, everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go.
Manhattan and Washington shut down. America closed all its airports, and world leaders began to react.
There have been the most terrible, shocking events taking place in the United States of America within the last hour or so, including 2 hijacked planes being flown deliberately into the World Trade Center. I'm afraid we can only imagine the terror and the carnage there, and the many, many innocent people that will have lost their lives.
Manhattan was in turmoil. New York's go-go mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, was soon on the spot. The damage he saw was epic, and he spoke of a tremendous number of lives lost.
The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear, ultimately. And I don't think we want to speculate on the number of casualties. The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible. And I don't think we will know the answer to that until sometime tomorrow or the next day.
Were there large numbers of firefighters?
We don't know how many we've lost, but there's no doubt we've lost some firefighters and police officers.
And no wonder, while firefighters and policemen were doing their utmost to cope with the collapse of the Trade Center's first tower to rescue people trapped inside, the second tower, mortally wounded by its hijacked airliner, also crumbled to dust. New Yorkers were shell-shocked.
What happened, man?
Big boom, come down the steps, everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy, crawled out, kept getting hit in the head, bags all around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. We did all right.
All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
A picture of devastation and a terrible reminder of how vulnerable in today's world of terrorism and suicide bombers its dominant power has proved to be. President Bush's expensive dream of a Star Wars missile defense scheme would have been powerless today. Heaven knows what the toll of death and injury will prove to be.
Well, let's speak first of all to Elaine Showalter, who's originally from New Jersey, living here now, but you have family in New York. What went through your mind seeing those pictures again?
Well, it's been a terrifying day that will live in infamy. And I think the worst of it was when it was happening, the very beginning. I was on Oxford Street and trying to think about how long it was going to go on when the reports were coming in, and you couldn't be sure whether there would be attacks in Chicago, Seattle, Pittsburgh, the rest of the country. But I think that Americans recover from these things incredibly fast, and that even by this time the recovery has begun.
You were contacting family and friends in New York yourself?
Yes, mostly by the internet, which is a big help because all the telephone lines are tied up, but we had email and everybody called back and forth, and messages are coming in, and people are beginning to post all kinds of messages on the net of help and support.
Let's speak to Richard Pearl, who was close to President George Bush Jr., but also was Assistant Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan. Mr. Pearl, people have been talking about this today as an act of war. Is that how you see it?
clearly it's an act of war, both in terms of its magnitude and its purpose. Behind these acts of terror are the states that support terrorism, the states that provide the recruitment, the organization, the sanctuary, the planning, the training, the logistics, the money. This could not happen without state support and state sponsorship, and the United States must now do something it has been reluctant to do, and that is hold the states accountable that permit this kind of terrorism to take place.
Stephen Simon, you are a former member of the U.S. National Security Council. On the point about how this could happen, a lot of people have been saying
We've had about a dozen ambulances, and as you can probably see behind me, we have some large truck here now, and there is some concern that the hospital could run out of water, so they have brought more water to the area. At this point, they're telling people in the city that if they can give blood, they should do so. They should.
几天惊蛰的时候去宣农坛宣耕田，去南苑狩猎的，这里都是必经之处。所以正阳门呢是专走龙车，也就是皇帝坐的车。所以在内城九门当中啊，正阳门的城楼和箭楼是最高的。那关于正阳门，不知道您是否留意？
on the level of diplomatic economy, but more than anything else, intelligence and operations to launch a full-scale struggle against world terror. It is all our Western civilization is now under attack. No way to ignore it. We know the names of these rogue countries. We know the names of the organizations. The intelligence community know to tell us where they are deployed, and it is a time for action, even if it's going to be a very tough and painful and maybe a struggle that will stretch over a few years.
Were you at all surprised that it could happen?
I was not surprised by the very attempt to destroy the Twin Towers. It already happened. But the combination and simultaneous effect of different places where different kind of airplanes were hijacked at the same time in a coordinated way is quite surprising.
And James Ruman, former Assistant Secretary of State, an attack on the centers of power, military, financial, and political.
Well, absolutely. This was an attack on the United States. But I think it's very important for us not to lose the larger picture. This was an attack on civilization. The World Trade Center is the center of Western civilization. It's where all the countries of the world trade in finance, in industry, in all sorts of products. There are going to be Japanese and Italian and Africans and Asians who are going to be working in those buildings or conducting some kind of commerce who are going to be killed by these terrorists. So it is an attack on the United States. It is an attack on American symbols of power. But more importantly, it's an attack on the civilized world. And now the civilized world has to get together and say, who are these uncivilized people who are prepared to do this, and get together and respond.
And what will have been the reaction of people who are in the job that you were in and other people in similar government jobs to what has happened?
Well, I think that government jobs are stressful enough as it is, but I can't even begin to imagine the kind of stress that is going on right now. I sat through a lot of stressful times, but I think they pale in comparison to this kind of attack on the United States in such a dramatic way. and having to leave all their buildings and get relocated. But I also believe that 24 or 48 hours from now, you're going to see people back in their offices. You're going to see the normal functionings of government. You're going to see a redoubled determination, and I think you're going to start to see a response from the American people to the realization that the outside world can affect us. Often the American people seem to think they're isolated, and I think it's been proven beyond doubt for forever that the United States can't stand isolated.
Let's hear from Khalid Haroub, who's a Middle East expert who is Palestinian. We were hearing there of different reactions among Arabs to what's happened. How do you read that?
Well, this is clearly reflects some sort of deep degree of dismay and frustration amongst the Palestinians and many Arabs vis-a-vis the American policy towards the Middle East, maybe peace process and other issues like Iraq and Sudan. But what I would like to say, actually, we shouldn't put the whole this horrific act into sort of a clash of civilization perspective. What if the actors of this act turn out to be from within Western civilization, like Oklahoma City bomber? And this is a possibility. And what I can see from all the reporting today is that there is some sort of strong assumption that those who committed this tragic act came from outside the Western civilization, either from Afghanistan, Arabs, Middle Eastern country, or whatever. Now, I think we have to wait and see, and not to jump into some conclusions.
Okay.
Otherwise, we are going to be in some sort of difficult
Right.
situation to understand.
All right, we'll come back to some of that. I should say we're just getting reports now of attacks, tracer fire in Kabul, and we will bring you any further details of that as we get them. Richard Pearl, actually, let me just bring you in on that point before we move on. Reports, as I say, of some attacks, explosions in Kabul. You any knowledge of what that might be?
No, I have no knowledge of it, but if it is retaliation against Osama bin Laden, it's long overdue and should be just the beginning of retribution against the state sponsors of terrorism.
Because it's thought that Osama bin Laden, who's been linked to this all through the day, is somewhere in Afghanistan and shielded by the Taliban regime there.
Indeed he is, but he works with other governments as well. And until we come to grips with government support for terrorism, we will be vulnerable to attacks even on this scale. This could not be done without governments that assisted in training pilots, in moving people, in moving resources, and providing intelligence.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pearl, and to all of you. We'll speak some more to you in a moment. I should say there are reports now of missiles being fired on or exploding in Kabul. We'll bring you any more on that as soon as we can. Now, the name of the Saudi-born terrorist Osama bin Laden, who we just mentioned, has been raised repeatedly today in speculation about who might have been behind what was, by terrorist standards, a massive operation. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, reports.
American investigators have a prime suspect, Osama bin Laden, a Saudi Islamist who'd threatened just 2 weeks ago to mount his most spectacular attack yet against American interests.
Osama bin Laden is somebody that for the last 20 years plus has been involved in one way or another in the activities of international Islamic movements of a militant nature, whether these be the involvement of Islamic fighters, mujahideen, etc. in the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets during the 1980s, or since the end of that war and the war with Iraq, specifically the Second Gulf War, somebody who has led, organized and financed international terrorism.
The bin Laden group, also known as Al-Qaeda, has not claimed formal responsibility for what happened today, but that's never been their style. It does seem, though, that claims by two other militant groups can be safely ignored. Bin Laden's past attacks have shown a very high level of organization and resources. In short, he's always strived for the most spectacular possible strikes. In 1995, he tried to bomb 11 American airliners on the same day. Several men have been jailed for their part in that conspiracy. 3 years later, his teams succeeded. The bombing of the US missions in Nairobi and Mombasa killed 224 people. Bin Laden has always appreciated the symbolic value of certain targets to his jihad. And last October, suicide bombers blew up an American cruiser in Yemen, killing 17 sailors. As usual, there was no formal claim of responsibility, but scenes of the blast were featured in a Bin Laden video circulated among Islamic militants.
There are Muslims throughout the world, and not just in the Middle East, who have a whole series of grievances against America. There's the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there's the Chechen issue, there are issues in which Muslims are involved in every continent of the world. And America is seen now by many Muslims as a bullying superpower and an anti-Islamic superpower. Now, not all Muslims share that view, but those Muslims who do share that view, many of them regard Bin Laden as a kind of Robin Hood figure.
By a terrible irony, Bin Laden was once the recipient of CIA arms and backing. That was during the struggle against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Later, as a member of a rich Saudi dynasty, he ploughed millions into setting up an organization dedicated to evicting American troops from Arabia. Early attacks were against those military targets. But as Bin Laden was banished from his homeland seeking refuge in Afghanistan, he widened his struggle to take in all American interests and to embrace the struggle against Israel.
This oppression, this atheism, which is overwhelming the land of Islam, cannot be destroyed by anything other than jihad, and other than the bullet, and other than martyrdom operations.
It does strike me that it has to be somebody who's got the resources, financial resources, the will, the organisation, and a lot of things point to him or to somebody like him, and very likely him. And I think that it's an extraordinary operation. They have managed, for instance, to evade detection through the normal means of communication. Doesn't seem to have been picked up. Extraordinarily sophisticated, long-term planning.
In a recent interview, Bin Laden threatened further attacks on American interests. There were suggestions, too, that he was being bankrolled by Iraq. A TV reporter was shown his desert training camp in Afghanistan and told that the al-Qaeda organization had thousands of supporters under arms. One of Bin Laden's lieutenants even spoke about drills for responses to American strikes on this base.
Earlier this year, in January, there was a very high threat announcement passed to American embassies and military establishments around the world. Last year, an American presidential commission on the terrorist threat visited London, including senators and security experts. And I recall very clearly, they told me, these people hate America, hate what America stands for, and seek to destroy us. So I don't think the actual attack will have been a surprise to American policymakers. The nature of the attack is the big surprise.
After the bombing of its embassies in Africa, America responded swiftly with cruise missile strikes against targets in Sudan and Afghanistan. If the Bin Laden organization is indeed publicly blamed in the coming days, a whole range of diplomatic and military options could come into play against Afghanistan and Bin Laden's followers.
Mark Urban reporting, and Mark joins us now. It seems there may be a missile attack on Afghanistan at this moment, is that right?
Indeed, those options may already be coming into play. There are reporters in Afghanistan tonight reporting that the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, is under missile attack. It's not clear yet. The Pentagon haven't confirmed whether indeed those are American missiles, but clearly this is the presumption of many people on the ground.
And that would start to look like a reprisal based on the speculation that we've seen about Mr. Bin Laden.
Well, clearly it would show a firm conviction on the part of the American security establishment that he was responsible, and a first expression of their anger that for years the struggle they've had to try and get this man handed over by the Taliban regime has been unsuccessful, and if you like, a visitation of their anger on that government.
Let's turn to Frank Gaffney, who's in Washington, a security expert there. Mr. Gaffney, it seems strange that America has such conviction now that Mr. Bin Laden was responsible, but had no warning that the attack was about to happen.
Well, obviously I'm not in a position to confirm that missiles have been launched in Kabul, let alone that that the United States government is acting on the supposition that bin Laden was responsible for this attack. I think, as Richard Pearl said a short while ago, if in fact the United States is acting, it's a very welcome and long overdue step, quite apart from his culpability for this crime, or these crimes I should say, this day of crimes. He is an enemy of this country. He has unleashed attacks against American citizens and property in the past, and there's no doubt, whether he did today's events or not, he would be up to it in the future, and he should be stopped. And those who are making common cause with him, who are sponsoring him, who are protecting him, who are permitting him to train in their countries, or otherwise making possible the kinds of sophisticated attacks he certainly has perpetrated in the past, should also be punished.
Richard Pearl, do you believe that there is a strong case for, if this is what it is, a missile attack on Afghanistan based on what's happened today?
Well, indeed. The fact is that bin Laden is permitted by the authorities in Afghanistan to operate from their territory. And I hope and believe that the United States will now adopt a policy of taking action in response to terrorist attacks against countries that facilitate and support terrorism, against countries like Iraq and Iran and Syria and Sudan and others, because until they pay a price for the support they give to terrorism, they will continue to enable acts of terror on this scale, and we must find a better way to cope with it than the policy of chasing down the individual terrorists.
Lord David Hanna, you were British ambassador to the UN. How does a country like the US strike back against terrorists unless it does it like this?
Well, this may be one way of doing it, if you identify very clearly who the origin of the attack is. An act of war has been performed against you and you have a right of retaliation. But there's a much wider international coalition that you've got to put together against terrorism, just as the former Prime Minister of Israel was saying. You've got to muster as wide as possible an international coalition, and you've got to use all the sources available to you, intelligence, economic, and so on. Because if you divide the world into one half that's chasing the terrorists and taking action against them, and the other who are not on your side, you're not going to actually prevail in this matter. You've got to have a much wider coalition. And that will be an important matter for tomorrow and the next day and many days after that. And America's allies are going to have to stand with her on this, because there's an act of war has been used against one of our allies. And we're going to have to work very hard to do this.
Do you think Britain would be in a position to back a strike on Kabul, if that's what it is,
that's
by
not for
the
me
United
to say.
States?
That's for the British government to say, and they will no doubt take the view if your reports are confirmed. But it's not for me to say whether they should or not. But if you're asking me, should Britain, as an ally of the United States, stand with the United States when an act of war has been taken against it? Yes, sure. We're members of the Atlantic Alliance, and that's what it says.
Ehud Barak, what's your reaction to, well, what we've just heard about the role of Mr. bin Laden in this, the speculation and supposition on that?
Look, even if it is not bin Laden who is behind this very attack, when you and the whole world will realize the death toll that had been paid in this event, it will become beyond any doubt of anyone on earth in the free world that a concerted attack against her should be taken, whether it's bin Laden or not. Bin Laden had done enough to justify what he might suffer in the future, and the same applies to the Hezbollah, to the Islamic Jihad, to the Hamas, to the whoever is ready to host these kind of activities should be automatically isolated from the community of nations and be treated as a rogue state, and every group of terrorists headed by whoever is there should be dealt with as terror thugs. Only the policy that our ancestors were ready to take against pirates on the high seas is appropriate.
Right.
A world concerted effort that will not stop before this phenomena is defeated.
Right. Now, must make it clear we don't yet know the cause of these explosions in Kabul, so it may not be an American attack. We can't tell at the moment. But Mr. Haroub, what do you make of that position, that if there's a situation that we have today, countries which host terrorists have a right should be attacked?
Well, I think this argument is now sort of void because the retaliation and the American response has been already done. I mean, if you got now some missiles...
We don't know that. I'm stressing that we don't know that.
Well, if you have, it depends. I mean, if it was really proven that bin Laden or any other group behind this act, and it was proven and a clear-cut evidence, then yes, the country under attack has the right to take the maximum measure against whoever threatens their security. This is a clear-cut and obvious case. But the thing is, what I am against actually is just to rush into even speculation, and the analysis, the whole analysis is going through the same line, is that the implicit assumption is somebody from there has done this. And the damage that we are doing by assuming this thing will never be able to be fixed up, even if it's proven in the future, in the near future, that somebody else was behind the whole thing.
Now, James Rubin, you were in the State Department when the US last attacked Afghanistan over Mr. bin Laden. Do you think that there will be a case for attacking Afghanistan again?
Well, obviously it depends on who's responsible. I think nobody likes to speculate in a situation like this.
But in a sense, to interrupt, it never goes beyond supposition on bin Laden, does it? Because he never claims responsibility.
Correct. But I think at the time of the attacks on the Kenya and Tanzania bombing, I think if you look through the court cases in New York, it's pretty clear that the bin Laden organization, and this is what people need to understand, it's not this one guy giving orders to 20,000 of his followers who then carry them out. It's a very loose-knit group of individuals who are trained, supported, funded by people under bin Laden's influence or who are connected to him, and he makes general points about what ought to be done with all this training and all this organization. And in the 1998 cases, it was proved beyond a reasonable doubt to American justice, which is a fine justice, that his organization was responsible for these kinds of attacks. The reason why we're talking about Osama bin Laden is because he's made the World Trade Center his target before. It's because he bombed the American embassy in Kenya, he bombed the American embassy in Tanzania, and he's made clear that he was responsible for the coal, probably. So he's made all these very targets his targets. And if today we find out that they've been attacked, I don't think it's highly speculative to focus our attention on Osama bin Laden.
But Richard Pearl, isn't a strike back at Afghanistan politically dangerous because you end up seeing pictures of civilians who've been killed and injured?
Well, we tend, when responding in this way, to be as precise as it is possible to be. It's worth drawing the contrast with the terrorist acts themselves, which were intended to destroy civilians and not the perpetrators of terrorism. But this mustn't be confined simply to targets in Afghanistan, because we know enough about the involvement of Iraq and other countries in the support of terrorism to know where we should strike back, and it is not just Afghanistan.
All right, well, we have yet, thank you, Mr. Pearl, we've yet to receive confirmation that that was any kind of attack on Kabul. We'll tell you as soon as we know. So what kind of America will emerge from this? We were just beginning to see the outline of President Bush's stance on the world stage, self-confident perhaps, but also inward-looking. Will he and his country now change? Here's Mark Urban again.
In America now, the destruction of lives and of property has been on such an epic scale that it'll leave its own miasma of fear and uncertainty. The Great Society has been exposed as vulnerable, and that is bound to be a traumatic discovery.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
But what does the American way say about how you respond to a second Pearl Harbor? Because that's how many politicians and commentators were quick to describe today's events. For one thing, it's taught Americans that there's no haven from the problems of the world.
I think the first reaction will be one of shock. I mean, you basically have a nation in shock, just as you have people outside of the United States in a kind of shock. Then there will be what comes after that, which will be quite traumatic, I think.
For some time before this incident, because this sort of thing can only happen if it's well planned, getting weapons on board.
Understood. Those people that were on planes that were turned round, though, are they now being put in hotels for the night?
Kind of attacked, if indeed that is what we are witnessing. What do you suspect is going on in Afghanistan right now?
Well, let's understand we're capable of pulling it off if that's what it is, but it's probably more likely the followers of Shah Massoud, who was deliberately bombed just yesterday and who was seriously injured, if not killed. Now, his representatives say he was injured, but he's all right. But there is some indication that he may have died in the attack, and he was, of course, the opposition to the Taliban over in Afghanistan, so it's a very serious situation over there as well.
But what about what former Secretary of Defense William Cohen just mentioned, that you would want to know who actually carried off these attacks before you planned any kind of retaliatory strike if this is not a result of some conflict within Afghanistan?
Well, I agree with Secretary Cohen. We have to be very cautious. On the other hand, I thought Secretary Eagleburger was very honest when he said that, look, the Taliban have been harboring Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden has said that it is the duty of every Muslim to kill Americans. There's every indication that he has been behind some of the attacks against American installations, and we happen to know just today that we've got information that indicates that representatives who are affiliated with Osama bin Laden were actually saying over the airwaves that, the private airwaves at that they had hit 2 targets. If you go back to the Millennium scare that we had before the year 2000, Osama bin Laden was in the middle of all of that, and the people associated with him and affiliated with him was in the middle of that. So this is a very serious situation. So they should not be harboring this criminal, and we've got to, it seems to me, go after him. And it does look, although the evidence is fragmentary, as though he's had a major role in what's happened here today.
Secretary Cohen, are you as convinced as Senator Hatch is that Osama bin Laden played some role in this tragedy here today?
I think if you were to cast the searchlight of probability on these footprints, they would lead to Osama bin Laden, but I still think that we have to get more evidence. This is not evidence that you would need in the prosecution of a criminal act. I distinguish between terrorism and a criminal act. And so I would think you just need more evidence than we have right now, but it doesn't have to be something you can use in a court of law. I think that the probability is it points to Osama bin Laden himself or the groups that he supports. And therefore, I think we ought to keep our focus very much on him, but not exclude others. And so I think a little more time is necessary, but I don't disagree with Secretary Eagleburger that we need to respond swiftly and very strongly to those who have inflicted this great tragedy upon the American people.
Secretary Cohen, it's Aaron Brown. We have heard in a number of conversations that we've had today that the United States needs to be more aggressive or more proactive in its counterterrorism efforts, that you can't wait until something has happened, that you have to stop it before, and it may be that some innocents will suffer because of it. That's a political problem, isn't it?
It is, and the thing we have to keep in mind is we do not want to allow terrorists to strike such terror in the hearts of the American people that we become like them, that we become indifferent to how many innocent people that we might kill. That is what separates us from terrorism and from the terrorists. We have a higher standard. So we have to be very careful in how we respond and how we take action against those who are planning further acts of terrorism against the American people, so that we don't become drawn down into that level of evil that they have perpetrated. So that's what distinguishes the American people and our ideals, and we ought to adhere to those.
And Senator Hatch, you think that the political equation on how the United States deals with this has changed because of what's happened today?
No question about it. We can't take this kind of action without a very heavy response. And we have some information, it may be fragmentary, but the fact is we have some information that indicates that, that Osama bin Laden and many of his affiliates and associates, he's certainly the motivating force behind these people. He certainly has the money, and he certainly has the ability to motivate antagonistic forces against the United States, and he said he wants to do that. So it looks very much like that, although we're not absolutely certain at this point.
But Senator, what Secretary Eagleburger said a little while ago, others have said, is not that we, as a country, not that the United States responds all the time, that at some point it needs to take a proactive, it needs to strike before the attack itself, before the terrorist attack. And if some innocents are hurt, if mistakes get made, that is an unfortunate reality. That's a political problem, and I want to know, I guess, from you, if you think the country, which has been reluctant to do that, will be less so because of today.
Well, this is an act of war. As far as I'm concerned, war's been declared against the United States. We ought to act accordingly, and we should have a very stiff response to that. And to be honest with you, it looks to me as though what's happened in New York, just think about it. There must be thousands of people killed here, probably more than at Pearl Harbor by far. And there is evidence, there is indication that there were people who have been affiliated with Osama bin Laden whose communications have been intercepted that basically have said that they got 2 targets. There's a lot of other information that is coming forward, although it's fragmentary and nobody can absolutely be guaranteed in the surety of it, but we all know that Osama bin Laden is doing everything he can to antagonize American forces, to try and hit against Americans. He's called for the death of Americans, and we ought to respond forcibly.
General Wesley Clark was a guest earlier today on CNN, and he began to express what most would interpret as a sense of outrage that we didn't know this was about to happen. There is a feeling that perhaps even during the last administration, too much emphasis was put on technical intelligence and not human intelligence.
Well, you got that right.
Do you buy that analysis?
Well, I surely do. As a matter of fact, we haven't been putting enough money in to the intelligence community, and we certainly haven't been putting enough human on the ground. That means human intelligence on the ground. And we've got to start doing that. And we've got to do a lot of other things. I reported last Sunday with Wolf Blitzer here that it's amazing, with all of the economic difficulties that they have, that the Russians have a better tactical fighter than we do, that it's more maneuverable, it is faster, and our pilots can fly it better than our F-15, which is becoming quite old, and we've been allowing our military to deteriorate. But not only that, our intelligence, we haven't been beefing it up like we should, and we know that terrorism is a reality out there, and especially against the United States, and we also know many of the people who are doing it. And the people who are excited about this over in the Middle East, who are dancing in the streets, who are making fun of the United States, we ought to remember who they are, because they're enemies of our country.
All right, Aaron and I would like to come back to you, Senator Hatch and Secretary Cohen. Right now, though, we're going to go back to Kabul, Afghanistan, where Nick Robertson has an update for us. Nick?
Well, I think if we review what we've been watching here in the last half an hour or so, we heard, first of all, aircraft coming in, then detonations around the city, then the fire and more detonations coming from what was we're told is an ammunition dump. We'll also fold into that the information we've been given here that 300 miles south of here in the spiritual heartland of the Taliban, their city of Kandahar, where their leader Mullah Omar lives, no reports of any detonations there. That city well beyond the range of the Northern Alliance forces. Certainly, the Northern Alliance forces, their commander, their key and pivotal commander, enemy number one of the Taliban, in fact, Ahmed Shah Massoud, attacked in a suicide attack on Sunday. Certainly, the Northern Alliance in a position right now to be feeling very, very aggrieved with the Taliban, and certainly very much in a mood for taking the battle to them on their terms. So looking across the city of Kabul now, it is very quiet. Just dogs barking. The fire from the ammunition dump continuing to burn on the horizon, that evaluating everything we've seen here this evening, what we could have heard was some of Massoud's Northern Alliance jets flying in here. This is something that they do very occasionally. Certainly the Northern Alliance very aggrieved at this stage, and then detonations and anti-aircraft fire coming up at the same time. Again, from our vantage point here over
terrorists, and one by one go through and find out whose side people are on. That is not waiting to find some lowest common denominator. That's leading in precisely the same way that President Bush led.
But Lord Hannay, is that an approach that works?
Well,
against terrorists?
Frank Gaffney also misrepresented what happened during the Gulf War, when President Bush's father put together this enormously powerful coalition. I didn't hear anybody say at that time it was a lowest common denominator coalition. It was a very powerful coalition, and it threw Saddam Hussein out of Iraq. And that is the sort of approach that I think you need. Now, out of Kuwait, sorry, out of Kuwait, sorry. And that is the sort of approach which I think is needed. It is not a lowest common denominator approach. But I think to say from the outset America can do all this on its own is not a wise approach.
Mr. Haroub, does America need to be more engaged in the Middle East peace process?
Well, first of all, the general point is that what I'm seeing is that the American policy in the last year is sort of getting more and more unilateral policy, isolationist thing, and the national missile defense, withdrawing from Kyoto and other international treaties. And now we hear the call for begging the other world to get together for multilateral action. So it's sort of contradiction in policies that you used to do this unilateral thing, and now you are seeking concerted effort towards confronting the situation. But I have to say actually that I was unhappy with the comments former Prime Minister said about the offer he mentioned that was the best for the Palestinians, simply because that offer did not meet even the minimum United Nations resolutions, which were seen as unjust even by the majority of Palestinians.
Let's not go back over that now, because I want to ask Richard Pearl about nuclear missile defense, which is right at the fringes of anybody's thoughts today, obviously. But it must be very difficult now, Mr. Pearl, for people to be making the case for this expensive anti-missile system, given that it would have been useless today.
Well, of course it would have been useless today, but it certainly wouldn't have been useless if a missile were pointed at the United States. And it is foolish to believe that because we are vulnerable to one threat, we should be vulnerable to all threats. Imagine if it had been a nuclear missile.
Mr. Barak, you wanted to say something about that?
It's just, what happened today just added to the need to have at least a theater and maybe trans-regional missile defense system against rogue countries like Iraq and Iran.
It wouldn't have helped today.
It wouldn't have helped, but this event emphasized that there are certain countries in the world, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, maybe Gaddafi, maybe one or more else, that are ready to threat the world order by using whatever they have. And without a missile defense that can at least cover 1,500 miles, about the distance from Tehran to Central Western Europe, you won't be able to have a world order.
Right. Okay.
What if the actors were from within the United States?
It still justifies a full-scale effort to put an end to world terror, without which not even what we have seen in America would ever happen.
Now, it is very early to be talking about the financial impact, but there was an immediate response on stock markets around the world, although the US markets were closed. In London, £67 billion came off share values, and we're joined now by our business correspondent, Paul Mason. Paul, tell us about that.
Well, Jeremy, this attack has really taken the heart out of the world financial system. It's located in New York, that's its financial centre. And these two buildings are actually home to some of the key companies in the stockbroking and allied trades of the world economy. Morgan Stanley alone occupies 50 floors of the South Building that was taken down today. And there's a whole ecosystem of other companies allied to that. It's not the physical damage. The systems will come back up. These firms will relocate to their disaster recovery sites. It's the human cost. Who's going to be sitting in the desks tomorrow morning and the day after when the markets come back up? Because today's death toll must surely include some of the key people who make the world's financial system work.
And is there going to be a longer-term economic impact, Paul?
Well, 24 hours ago, we were all asking ourselves, will a series of bad economic data in the USA actually hit the US economy and push America into a recession? That's a bit of an academic question now, because we've got fund managers in charge of $100 billion saying recession is almost inevitable. People will take their money out of shares and put them into much safer investment vehicles. Bonds, gold and Swiss francs are what people are buying. And the Pearl Harbor analogy is apposite, because that's exactly what people started buying on the eve of World War II.
What can we expect in the coming days? One imagines that maybe the US would think about cutting interest rates, for example.
Well, the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank have both said they will pump liquidity, money, into the system. We had a run on the east coast of America today on hole-in-the-wall cash machines. So the cash is there to underpin that. We can probably expect a swift interest rate cut. But the real question is what happens to consumer confidence. The economists were all telling us that if the stock market goes into free fall, as it might when it comes back up on Thursday, then that hits American consumer confidence, that pushes America into recession. Maybe now we don't need that transition belt, because if the American people think they are at war, what happens then to consumer confidence?
Paul Mason, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Just to say that CNN are reporting that the White House is denying that the US has had anything to do with those explosions we reported in Kabul. We're joined now by Martha Carney, who is in Downing Street. Martha, what's happening there?
Well, certainly from the British government's point of view, it does sound like it backs up what you've been saying about what's been happening in Kabul. They certainly haven't heard anything officially yet. I've just been talking to the Prime Minister's official spokesman, and their view is that simply because of the scale of what's happened in the United States, what's got the effect for the stability as well as the appalling tragedy, there is bound to be a response. And Britain is going to stand by America. I mean, that was very much in line with the Prime Minister's rhetoric early today, talking about standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States. But make no mistake about it, this will be controversial. If we look back to earlier precedents when Britain supported America when it bombed a factory in Sudan, again after action by Osama bin Laden, it was controversial both within the Labour Party itself and with the European allies. And I've been talking to a cabinet minister tonight who says that if Britain does support any kind of massive retaliation carried out by the United States, there would be a real danger to the world and in fact could end up with Britain itself becoming a target.
And there are security aspects in this country that are being worried about now, Martha.
Yes, that's certainly true. That's why we've been seeing a government meeting chaired by Tony Blair himself earlier this evening, the COBRA meeting. This is senior colleagues in the cabinet looking at the kind of measures that may be necessary here. They've already carried out restrictions on aeroplanes, for example, much tighter security in bases. And that meeting will be adjourned until tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock when Tony Blair himself will also be present.
Martha Carney in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed. We can just have a look at the front pages of tomorrow morning's papers, and starting off with The Guardian, which you can see there, the huge photograph. A declaration of war is their headline, the World Trade Tower explosion there, front page. The Sun next. Again, two huge pictures, all the same pictures. They say the day that changed the world by their masthead. Suicide hijackers blitz America, special edition, paper full of the story that we have been reporting all programme. Daily Mail. Their headline is Apocalypse, New York, just the date there, September the 11th, 2001. Skyline shot of New York's vastly altered skyline as a result of today's horrific activity. 30 pages of pictures and special reports, they say. Telegraph, again, dramatic picture of the second impact of the plane, and their word in the headline is war there as well. And their whole paper is full of it too. And the Financial Times front page looks like that. Assault on America. Again, a picture of the skyline. President George Bush's remarks summarized. And the US military, they say, is on a near war footing this morning following terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. That is all from Newsnight tonight, on the day that the United States came under unprecedented terrorist attack, destroying the World Trade Center in New York, killing and injuring an as yet unknown number of people. There is video footage of explosions in the Afghan capital Kabul tonight, but the White House, as we were saying, has denied that American forces are involved. There is round-the-clock coverage on News 24, which will be broadcast on BBC One throughout the night, and we'll be back, of course, with more tomorrow. Till then, from all of us on Newsnight, a very good night.
Good evening. We've had a relatively dry start to the week, but in the next 24 hours, many parts will see a spell of wet and windy weather and increasingly squally winds by Thursday. The potential.
"70% of our planet is covered by water, yet we know little about the seas around us. Now a new series takes you further